Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mayor Diane Marlin, and I'd like to welcome you to this moderated town hall with the finalist for City of Urbana's Chief of Police. We're very pleased to have retired Police Chief Larry Boone of Norfolk, Virginia, join us today. Chief Boone emerged as the finalist for this position, resulting from a nationwide search that began last summer. Chief Boone recently spent 3 days in Urbana in internal and external meetings with various city departments and community stakeholders. So today we continue the public participation in the search process through 2 moderated town halls this afternoon and evening. Following these town halls, we'll make decisions as to the next steps. And just as a reminder, as with any City of Urbana department head or chief, City Council approval of the mayor's appointment for Chief of Police will be required. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize members of the Urbana City Council in attendance today. I see Mary Alice Wu and Chris Evans, and I believe that's City Council rep today. And I also want to thank specifically Human Resources Manager Famie Fletcher for working with the search firm and coordinating the search efforts for the city. And I also want to thank and acknowledge the contributions of all the city staff who are helping with logistics today. And finally, our appreciation goes to Interim Police Chief Rich Searles and Interim Deputy Chief Matt Bain for their leadership of the department over the past year. So I'd like to now introduce Tracy Parsons, who will moderate this afternoon and evening's town halls. Mr. Parsons is a longtime Urbana resident. He currently serves as Community Relations Manager for the City of Champaign, and he facilitates the Community Coalition. And we're grateful for his assistance today. Again, thank you all for attending, and I'll turn this over to Tracy.
Yeah. So I'm not going to stand this time now. And I noticed, it's kind of like the classroom. Everybody got and sat toward the back of the room. Feel free at any point if you want to get a little closer to Chief Boone to feel the energy and all of those wonderful things. That's allowed, okay? And so thank you, Mayor and City Council members for asking me to be a part of this process. It's very, very important and critical at this time in our community. And really, I believe, great work we've done in the last decade to address our police community issues. We've done great work as a community, and I want us to not always focus on what we haven't done or what doesn't go right, but what has gone right. And all of the policies and practices that we've put in place to address our community's most difficult challenges and issues, we've done a great job as a community. And work is still ahead of us. So this is a great opportunity for us to participate in the process. 10 years ago, I don't think we would have had a meeting like this, right? So again, when you think about our progress, and what we've put in place to address our police community issues, challenges, and opportunities. So thanks to all of you for coming out. So just to give Chief Boone a little bit of an opportunity to know the audience. So city staff that might be here. Okay, so we got a lot of city staff coming out to learn about you and meet you. And community organizations, let's say not-for-profit, so we've got a few of those. Business community, anybody from the business community here? All right, they're still working, middle of the day, making money, doing those things. If you work with youth in our community, raise your hand. Okay. All right, so Amy's new to town. She's the new Boys and Girls Club director. I just saw her. I'm glad you could make it out, Amy. All right, so enough of me. Chief Boone is going to kind of just offer some opening statements, and then thank you for those of you that have submitted questions. I think there are going to be people around. If you have a question, hopefully we'll be able to get to them. We had a number that have been submitted And Famy's done a great job in kind of putting those in categories that I'll explain later. But Chief Boone, welcome to Urbana, Illinois.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank you all for showing up. I know you're busy, and I got to tell you, this has been an intense process. You should thank Mayor Marlin, because I can tell you, I've interviewed for some large cities, don't even come close to this process. So nobody's giving me anything, although I'm the only candidate. I will say this, everybody's treated me with open arms. This is a beautiful community, the community that I've seen thus far. You know what? If I become chief, you officers are going to occupy the front row. You guys are so brave. You're going to burning buildings and shooting individuals and all kinds of things, and you're sitting in the back row. I used to be the same way. But anyway, folks, look, a little bit about me, and I'll apologize to you that have heard this before. But it's important that you know about me so you have an understanding of how I view things and how I move. So I grew up in New Brunswick, New Jersey, public housing. Our public housing is a bit different from some of the public housing I've seen here. We had very tall buildings. Didn't have many opportunities for advancement in terms of employment, education, things of that nature. Any of you that are familiar with public housing, you know all the challenges that presents. I won't bore you with that. At some point in my young life, I became a target of law enforcement, and I said target because I was frequently stopped for no apparent reason. And out of frustration, I bucked, and subsequently, a decision was made to send me south to live with my grandparents. So I did fairly well in a new environment. You know, I always say if a child sees something different, he or she is able to excel. I was able to graduate from high school with a athletic scholarship. I wish I had an academic scholarship. Nonetheless, I went to school free, okay? And on a football scholarship. And I played for Georgia Southern University, 6 times national champions. I was largely responsible for 2 of those championships. You know I'm kidding, right? So my senior year, I had an opportunity to see something very rare. Now, when I say this, people kind of tilt their head like, really? My senior year, on the sideline, I saw my first African-American police officer. I'd never seen one before. And the guy was so impressive. He was put together. I just knew I wanted to do that. So I had another itch I wanted to scratch before taking that opportunity. I wanted to play in the National Football League, the NFL. Got a tryout, and unfortunately for me, the NFL meant not for long. So I ended up joining the police department, and I had a great time. I did all the sexy stuff. What do I mean by that? K-9, SWAT, vice narcotics, undercover work, community relations work, you name it, I've done it. I am the first officer in the history of Norfolk, which is 234 years old, to occupy every rank in the history of that department. I did well on the examinations. I went from corporal to sergeant, lieutenant, captain, assistant chief, deputy chief, and chief. Now, I say all that to say, I'm not the smartest in the room, but I work hard. And in my efforts as chief in Norfolk, and you'll see it here if I'm selected to be here, I'm very intentional. I'm not a sit behind the desk kind of guy. I can move in any space. I'm very comfortable with Caucasians, African American, Asians, Hispanics, LGBTQ, doesn't matter who. I just love people. I love people that want to do the right things for their community, that want to have a part in their community, but at the same time, I want you to support the police. I understand police get a raw deal, particularly the last 2 or 3 years. And I say this, and I go to my grave believing this. And you've heard it before, the majority of policemen are good people. That's a fact. I know that because I spent the bulk of my career investigating officers, whether I was in internal affairs, whether I was a supervisor, or at the chief level. We get it right far more than we get it wrong. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong. But that doesn't mean when you get it wrong, you try to terminate somebody's life. There's opportunity for coaching, mentoring, and counseling. That's where I come from. Now, those things that are clearly wrong, I'll deal with. I have this philosophy. There's mistakes of the head, right? Mistakes of the head. A little late for work, you may be rude, things of that nature. Let's coach them up, mentoring, get back out there. And then there's mistakes of the heart. I don't tolerate that. Mistakes of the heart, stealing, lying, things of that nature. You have to be terminated. You have to be separated from this environment. So I'm going to cut it short because I can get long-winded. But what I want from you is straight and forward, hard and fast questions. I don't yield from anything. So I look forward to this discussion, and I'll yield for now.
All right. So once again, I think as we go along and question pops in your head, we have a couple of staff from the city that's here that will get those questions from you and then get them to me. So we were able to receive quite a few questions pre-meeting. They've been grouped in a couple of different areas. So we have community engagement, youth intervention and school partnership, policing strategy, crime intervention, gun violence, civilian police review, leadership and accountability, diversity, social service, restorative justice, and then we have a couple of miscellaneous questions. So I'm going to start, and not in any particular order. So the first one, Chief Boone, is tell us about Larry, not the police chief. What does Larry like to do, be involved in, and his time off, hobbies, etc.?
So I'm a very private guy. Things I do to kind of take off the hat, so to speak. I love movies. Ironically enough, I like gangster movies. I really do. Scarface is my favorite movie. I know. Conversely, It's a Wonderful Life is one of my favorites too. I say all that to say, to give you kind of reach I have. I spend a lot of time in the gym. I'm a gym nut. I was once Mr. Old Dominion. That's a bodybuilding contest. I love sports, but I spend the bulk of my time movies, reading books. I do have one advice. Rich knows what that is. For now, I'll keep that to myself. But nonetheless, I am married. I have 2 wonderful children. They're adults. And what you'll find, despite my exterior, that I'm a very approachable, engaging individual. And I don't operate from a position of being pretentious. People know when you're faking it. I'm going to reach your heart. And if I capture your heart, I'll capture your minds.
So I gave you a nice little softball to start it off. Let's talk about civilian review boards. Talk about your experiences with them, positive, negative, um, just civilian review board for police.
All right, CRBs. Now, what a lot of folk don't know, I remember having a Zoom with Mayor Marlin and Callan Minton. We're talking about CRBs. And I made the comment, you know, there's 18,000 police departments in the country. There's only about 200 CRBs in the country. So it's relatively new. And I guess what you want to know is whether or not I support that concept. I do. I support that concept with some caveats, though. I believe at the end of the day, when it comes to discipline, that recommendation should be with the chief of police. Here's why. Because when it comes to rolling out discipline, there's so many technicalities and nuances that it's impossible for everyday citizens to understand the nuances of policies, predicament, law, at first blush. That takes time, okay? I said earlier that I spent the bulk of my career disciplining officers. You know, I was making decisions differently at the end of my career than I did in the beginning. But I had 30-something years to prepare for that. Here's an example, and this is what the data shows. The data says civilians will have a hard time terminating an officer during a holiday season if he or she has deemed to have been involved in excessive force, let's go a little higher, or lying. They have a hard time terminating officers during that time of year. That's what the data shows. Police chiefs don't, because they know once you lie or steal, you have tarnished the badge. There's no fixing that, all right? So where I sit, I support CRBs, but I stand firmly to the ground that the final say should be with the chief of police.
Did you have one in Norfolk?
Believe it or not, we were just developing our CRB. And I was part of that process as well. And the way it was going to look was that the council selected the members. And there were some guidelines with respect to membership. I had nothing to do with that. But the membership had a spokesperson. That spokesperson was afforded to look at any investigation from the genesis of the investigation. So if there's an interview room and there's two investigators and there's an officer or a civilian, that individual has the ability, whether it be via camera or in the room itself, to view the interviews. Can't ask any questions, but they would be in a position to view the interview. Once the investigation is complete, they will get a file of the investigation, and they will be able to share said findings with the CRB board. But again, the ultimate recommendation stayed with the chief of police.
So as I shared with you in the back, and I shared with Chief my long history of community work here, community side of this discussion would say the push for CRB is around police investigating police. That's the challenge with not having an independent piece. So they would say police investigating police.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying the community doesn't necessarily trust the police. Okay.
I think that's in the core of it.
Okay, that's fair. So which is why you have to have a compromise. And that's where I operate, from a position of compromise. I understand why, folks may not trust police investigating police. I get it. I understand it. But the other side of that is, I said earlier in my statement, that we get it right far more than we get it wrong. And I wouldn't have a problem opening up with some reservations in terms of processes, an interview or an investigation to a CRB. The only way we move the needle, folks, is through compromising, the democratic way. If we both, when I say we, I'm talking about community and I'm talking about PD. If we both dig our heels in the ground, we'll never move the needle. Police officers kicked and scream about body-worn cameras. At the end of the day, they appreciate body-worn cameras. You know why? Let's say Mr. Joe, who's notorious for making false allegations, now is captured on camera. We used to have those Mr. Joes in Norfolk, and I loved, as the chief of police, because I would talk to anybody. I'm not one of those guys that says, you can't get to me. You can get to me. In fact, I gave every citizen in Norfolk, anytime I had a function like this, they got my cell phone number. I don't have a problem with that. And Mr. Joe would call me and he would complain that officer so-and-so did so-and-so. I would look at the body-worn camera, invite Mr. Joe into the office. Let's take a look at it. Show me where this happened. You don't know where I'm going. So, having said all that, body-worn camera has changed that, okay? It's changed that belief to some degree, all right? There's still folks, no matter what, they're gonna dig their heels in, and that's fine. We'll deal with that. So that's where I stand with that.
So this is under the general category of diversity. We're going to try to combine a number of these questions. So what do you plan to do to improve relationships with minority groups? And then also improve for minorities within the department. But I also see here information about our gay and queer communities as it relates to diversity. I see some references to pride festivals and ways that we recognize our diversity in our community. You have thoughts about our minority groups in the community that police has to interact and work with, and then think about your minority officers and environment for them.
That's a lot to unpackage in 5 minutes. So let's start with the external first, then we'll work our way inward. I'm the very proud father of a transsexual son. My son is the bravest person I know. And one of the things that I recognize is that when certain groups view law enforcement with a jaded eye, it's my role, in my leadership team's role, is to help alleviate that. And when I recognize those issues, I take measurable steps to try to fix it. I'm just not going to just talk about it. Folks, anybody talks about it and never implements policy, it's just talking. Give an example. We had a member of the LGBTQ plus community was a victim of a homicide. And one of my young investigators was investigating the homicide, meant no harm, mistake of the head, used the wrong pronoun when speaking with the family. The family was upset, naturally. The family had communications with some of the LGBTQ plus membership groups, and they wanted this officer fired. Mistake of the head. As a leader, I recognize a blind spot that perhaps we create a policy so that this doesn't happen again, but not just create a policy, involve those that was affected. So what does that look like? I had my policy-making team, as well as members of the LGBTQ plus community, formulate a policy so that that officer, or any other officer for that matter, would not make that same mistake of the head. You know how far that went in that community? That's one example. Let's push that over here. With respect to the African American community, look, we all recognize the challenges that the profession has had. We've created some of that ourselves, unfortunately. But as I stand here, there's a different kind of group of officers, you know, and you have to be very strategic in how you go about approaching that, because these young officers will say quickly, I had nothing to do with that. I wasn't around. And I would say to them, but you wear the uniform. And because you wear the uniform, it's my job to inform you, at least educate you why you may not be readily accepted in certain communities. A lot of cops don't know that. A lot of cops don't know about Bull Connor or Slave Patrol or civil rights and how we played a role as an agent of social control. They don't know that. So what I did in Norfolk, we went to the museums. Let them see it for themselves. The African American Museum as well as the Holocaust Museum. I don't know if we can afford to do that here, can we? But nonetheless, my position is always going to be, here's why. Because they deserve to know why folks may feel a certain way. And it's on me and my leadership team to develop processes to make it easier to absorb. Now, another part of that was African Americans looking at law enforcement in some cases as not legitimate. You know, in Norfolk, we had a partnership. We had bias-based policing training, and we probably had it here in Urbana. Took it a little bit further, though. With that training, we invited the community, those communities that may not trust the police, to the same training with the police. And we didn't get to do the blue pile. You know what I mean by blue pile? You see how they're sitting? All cops, blue pile. So the way I operate, you have a cop, a citizen, cop, you get the picture. So they're going through this week-long training. But not only that, at the end of the training, both sides recognize their biases. Now, I'm no fool. I know 40 hours of training is not going to move the needle. That same group, I created a fair and impartial policing team. So what did they do? I allowed the community to go through policies that they thought adversely impacted them. And collectively, PD and community, those communities that didn't necessarily trust the police, make changes to how we operated in some cases. There weren't wholesale changes. I'm not going to allow changes to be made that put the officers in harm's way, but believe it or not, the community kind of came up with some ideas or some positions that made sense. You know, some of our targets were all African Americans for a large part. You know, I understand how that could look, so we changed that. We allowed them to change our mission statement. That was huge. Our mission statement had been the same for decades. We allowed them to change our value statement as well. So that's that. That's just one of many things that we were able to do in Norfolk. I believe in actionable partnerships. You know, coffee with the cop is fine. I'm not knocking that, but that doesn't move the needle. Partnerships that require both sides, PD and whoever that agency is and whoever they represent, we're going to go into this equally. Your last piece. And Norfolk is the most diverse police department in the state of Virginia. We were intentional about that. You know, and it's not just because of me. I just followed what I learned from my predecessors. Chief Hank Henson hired me when I was a young officer, Caucasian man. He was just so fair. Just so fair. He was one of these guys that you can approach. You didn't think you were talking to a policeman, but he understood those histories that I spoke about earlier. And he made it so that minorities, members of the LGBTQ plus community, women, African Americans, not only can they join the police department, they can excel as well. I just took it further. I made it inclusive. He made it diverse-wise, more pronounced. I just made it inclusive because you got a problem when everybody at the table look like you, okay? You got some blind spots. Let me give you an example. So in Norfolk, when I became assistant chief, I'm the only minority there. My colleagues were all white men, good people. And one of the things that African-American officers would always complain about, to include women, was they never had an opportunity to get training. So I'm looking for this. So in my agency, we all signed off on this document that we're going to send 40 individuals to this high-level training. I'm looking at this document. I put it down. I said, you know what? These are all white guys. They're good guys, but there's folks out here that's been complaining about this. And each one of them, all four of them, say, Larry, you're absolutely right. That's why you're here. Call us out. So I understand how the community view the police. I understand how minority officers feel internally. But I also understand how white males feel, because I will tell you this, most of my programs, and we have a ton of programs in Norfolk, and we were recognized nationally and internationally because of our programs. 70% of the officers that participated in it were white males. I've seen them put together their money to buy a young lady a bicycle that was stolen. I've seen so many wonderful things done by officers that folks need to recognize. You know, I'm going to challenge, if I'm your chief, I'm going to challenge community, I'm going to challenge city council, I'm going to challenge folks to recognize these officers when they do good things, then hold us accountable when we don't.
So thank you for that. Next time I'll remember not to pack it all in there together. All right. So community orienting policing, the title that probably means differently to each person that's in the room, but the question would like to know your thoughts on your philosophy around community orienting policing. What does that mean? And if you can give examples of implementation of community oriented policing practices or policies, things that you've implemented.
Okay, I'm gonna try to be real quick because I get long-winded because I get excited. I love talking to folk. So that means that different things to different communities. Every community is different, and it looks differently to every community. My understanding of community-oriented policing is working together collaboratively to address issues in your community. solving problems, taking preventative measures. And if you've missed out on those preventative measures, there's opportunities for intervention, and lastly, enforcement. Prevention, intervention, enforcement. So I said earlier, I don't believe in doing anything that you cannot move the needle. One of the things that is an issue across the nation is the school-to-prison pipeline. I wanted to address that in a very meaningful way in the city of Norfolk. So we partnered with a church that had a tutoring program in which they partnered with 10 Title I schools. You know what I mean by Title I schools. So we were allowed to participate in the mentoring program. The unique thing about this program was most of the kids were African American, and most of my officers that volunteer were Caucasian. But the beauty of it is, the officers was going into those same communities that they were called there for to enforce the law, and sometimes it didn't always look pretty. And sometimes those children saw that. So what could that have possibly done to that young child and his image of PD? But you know, over the course of a whole school year, because that's how the program worked, you volunteered once or twice a week for a whole school year. You have a partnership and a dynamic that changed perspective on both sides. You know, children, they're going to go home and talk and say, Officer so-and-so and so gave me a lollipop or bought me X, Y, and Z or something to that effect. Because a lot of these kids, they were living in poverty, okay? And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen officers go into their own pocket because so-and-so is wearing the same shirt or the same pair of underwear or whatever the case. I've seen it too many times. But you have this young kid that's going home with things perhaps his parents couldn't have addressed, but they were appreciative. I know because I've seen the dynamics at the end of the school year. I've been dying to meet you, Officer so-and-so. So-and-so has spoken so highly of you. Beautiful. Conversely, you have an officer that has been going into these neighborhoods and they get frustrated going into the same neighborhood. They start to build these preconceived notions, but they look at this little kid. You know, he's just like my kid. He's just like my niece or nephew. So I highlight that particular program because it moved the needle. I started off with the school, the prison pipeline. If you cannot read by the time you hit the 3rd grade, it's a pretty good chance that's what's going to happen to you, right? Every one of these children, for the most part, at the end of that school year, could read on the level that was required to go further. And I'm gonna tell you, we were in our 7th year with that program. And it's just so many kids, not enough volunteers. But at the end of the year, to see grown men and women crying because they have to separate at that point and get a new mentee, and parents taking a different perspective of law enforcement, and the young folks taking a different perspective of law enforcement. That's beautiful, folks. You know, we have to be intentional. We have to have hard conversations. We have to give praise when praise is due. We have to hold folks accountable when that's due. I said earlier, and I'm not trying to curry favor because that's just not how I operate. I've seen policemen do some incredible things. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So let's stay on the youth area. Let's start off with policing in the schools. Could be SRO program, but your thoughts about police in schools and that partnership and what that looks like to you?
So Yeah, that's kind of related to the first question, and I'll take it from this perspective. I embrace it, SROs in school. Children will let you know whether or not they embrace that officer. But here's where I draw the line. The officer is there to enforce crime, not to be a disciplinarian, not to say, little Johnny, won't go to class. I'm gonna call officer so-and-so. And so that's not our role. Our role is to enforce the law and to mentor and guide young folk, just like the reading program. The other part of that is you're not going to be an SRO under my leadership just because it's comfortable. I need to know you can do the job. And part of that requires you to be able to be knowledgeable when the time comes to protect those precious resources. I've seen too many departments far too many times put folk in that position because it's comfortable. I got to know you can do the job when there's an active threat or some type of threat to the staff as well as the child. So wrap that up. Yes, I embrace the concept of SROs. I think they play a tremendous role in any community if it's done right. And there's an understanding and the MOU between PD and the school department. Yes, I embrace it.
So this next part of the question is phrased around negative interactions between police and primarily Black youth. How do you approach that? How do you approach that subject and topic when far too often it's not all Black youth have negative reactions or relations with police? So I don't want to phrase it from that place, but we've got a history, as you addressed earlier, of addressing Black youth and police. Your thoughts, philosophy, approach to addressing that if you were to be brought in as chief?
So now I'm not able to see that question 2020 because I don't know all the dynamics here in this city. I can address that from a historical perspective. And when you say youth, we're talking about young men or youth?
Well, it doesn't get that specific, but
well, let me address it from both perspectives because I can tell you, youth. I can tell you, put any cop in uniform and let him walk through an elementary school. I want to be a cop. Put him in that high school. It's a little bit different. So, how do we address that? Let's start with the youth. One of the things I think is important, and I said it earlier, is you got to have actionable partnerships. I believe during the summertime, when kids are out of school, that's an ideal time to have a youth academy. You run it all summer. You don't need a whole lot of resources. 2 or 3 officers that want to do it, that are engaging. It gives our youth an opportunity to engage with our officers. It gives the community an opportunity to invest in our youth. It gives an opportunity for our youth to see officers in a different light, much like the tutoring, mentoring program. With respect to our older youth, I think there's an opportunity there. One of the things we did in Norfolk was we tread it lightly because we understand this is a difference, but a lot of our older, particularly African Americans, were having a hard time getting jobs. Everybody's not going to college. Okay, I don't care what you say, everybody's not cut for it. But people are cut for different opportunities. So as a department, we partnered with Walmart, Target, the military, various factories, so that these young folk that may not necessarily embrace police in the beginning started to at the end because we were giving them opportunity in terms of employment immediately after school. Now, again, younger folk, that's not the challenge. The challenge is to stay with them until they get to high school. There's a lot of things you can do to do that, to bridge that gap. One of the things you can do is start a cadet program. You know, people always say we don't have enough females. We don't have enough African Americans. Well, darn it, be intentional. You know, and in high school, start a program. Say this is what we're targeting, and allow them to come around the police department, get to meet folk, because a lot of times there are perceptions of law enforcement that's just not true. Now, I don't want to pretend that we don't have bad apples, plural, because we do. All right, I've fired officers for rape, for lying, stealing. I've fired a lot of officers. And if I fire you, you've really crossed the line.
So there's a couple questions I'm going to combine. We got one today that I like. Then I saw, well, I shouldn't say it like that. I like all the questions. But one came in today, and it's talking about differences in size between Urbana and Norfolk. And then there's some other questions in our pre-questions about your approach in your first few days, your first few months. Talk to us a little bit about the difference in the size of the community, but how you would approach policing here with such a significant size difference. Question here says about 200,000 people difference. I don't know if that's factual or not, but your thoughts about coming to a smaller community when you've been in the bigger city and policing and meeting in the first few days, all of those kind of things.
That's a good question. It's a fair question. You know, where's Famey? Is she in here? Okay. So first time Famey picked me up from the airport, she says, you're going to hear some things that are a little bit different, and you're going to have to, you know, figure out how you're going to handle those concerns. And I stood perpendicular to the floor. And as a Famey, I've interviewed in St. Louis, Cincinnati, and some big places. I don't care if it's a 30,000-man department or a 30-man department. I don't care if it's a 245,000 population or it's a 48,000 population. It's the same. I hadn't heard anything unique that I didn't hear in Norfolk, St. Louis. Your problems are universal. You're not unique. You really aren't. So what would I do differently? Nothing.
All right. That's fair. That's fair. I'm not going to try to create something if nothing's there, right? All right. I love that. So, talk about it. You mentioned and touched on accountability, internal for your department, and what does that look like, and expectations around accountability for you and your leadership team, and how that plays in a department that you are chief.
Accountability. Accountability is often tossed on PD, but there's enough accountability to go around, okay? Yes, naturally on PD, there should be accountability with respect to how we conduct ourselves with our community, how we carry ourselves when we are engaging in a legal law enforcement activity, how we should intervene when one of us may not be at his or her best. How I, as a leader of the department, should hold folks accountable when they do wrong and not give them a wink and a nod and say, we'll deal with that later. That's not who I am. If anybody thinks that, wrong guy. But at the same time, it's my responsibility to ensure that they have the right resources in terms of equipment, personnel, and lastly, pay. Because what I've learned, officers, and when I just said those three things, personnel, equipment, and pay, that's city part. That's their role in being accountable, okay? Like I said, that goes around all spectrums. So if you can address officers' needs, not wants, needs, they'll thrive and they'll be happy. And they're going to talk about Urbana PD. You know, we got this new guy. He walks with a swagger a little bit. Sounds a little bit like Obama. I'll tell you, and then you're going to have folks want to come over here. Your best recruiters are the happy policemen. But the other side of that accountability part is community. Hold us accountable. But darn it, when we do something good, that same energy, that same swagger, I want to hear it. And if I don't hear, I'm going to call you out on it. Next.
Okay, all right. So our community, like many communities across the country, has experienced an unprecedented level of gun violence, shooting incidents. And so while this year we've had a better year than the last couple that have been historic, what's the police's role in crime prevention and addressing our gun violence crisis? How do you see law enforcement's role in addressing this issue?
So, coming from the city where we average about 60 to 80 homicides a year, and gun violence being at an all-time high, particularly in the state of Virginia, we changed our process in terms of how we go about addressing gun violence. Let me just, and this a little drawn out here, but it's important. So when I became chief in 2016, December 2016, the local paper said, most violent year in a decade due to rap gangs and guns. And accompanying that caption was a photograph of 3 young men, all African American, and each one had a gun in their hand and they were smiling. And then naturally, I wanted to know how these young men were getting these guns. These were teenagers, young men. 2 or 3 months later, 2 of the 3 were dead due to gun violence. So what I mandated in my department was, we need to find out where these kids are getting these guns. Historically in Norfolk and a lot of departments across the country, if we solved a crime involving a handgun, we typically put the gun in evidence and never paid attention to it again unless the case came up. That didn't make sense to me because when we were recovering guns, they were in the hands of a felon who can't buy the gun to start with, or they were in the hands of our youth, some as young as 9 years old. And I needed to find out what was going on under the bed, so to speak. Take a look under the bed. So what we started doing, we started tracking every gun we recovered. We partnered with the ATF. They did E-Trace. Folks, what I mean by E-Trace is like your thumbprint. Okay, every gun has a thumbprint that can trace you back to the natural or the original purchaser. So we did this over the course of 5 years, and let me just show you what happened over the course of 5 years. So we recovered about 6,000 guns. Every one of them purchased legally, every one. 96% of those guns ended up over here. And over here, not you, Madam Mayor, but over here is the challenging communities, okay? Where you're gonna find young folk and some of those felons I talked about, where most of the crime was occurring, where we recovered those guns. 100% bought legally, 95, 96% of those guns over here. Only 200 reported stolen. Just 200 out of 6,000 guns. What does that say? I expect you guys in the back to know what that says. You got some straw purchasing going on. So when the moment I made that information available for public consumption, because that's what I'll do. I love data. I don't hide it. I know folks move when they see data. I put that information out on our social media. I got a call from Senator Kane, Congresswoman Loria, and Bobby Scott. Larry, what can we do? And also ATF. So what we ended up doing was that year in Norfolk, they went to the General Assembly and had some things changed. Prior to them going to General Assembly, you could purchase as many guns as you could afford every day. If you could afford 30 guns a day, no problem. And at the end of that day, you decided you didn't like those guns, you can dump them wherever you wanted to. We got law changed where you can only purchase one gun a month. In addition to that, those folks that were involved in illegal activity had to change their behavior too, because prior to the law changing, where they had to report their guns lost or stolen now, we'd go to Mr. Joe's door and knock on his door and say, Mr. Joe, your gun was used in a homicide. Do you know where your gun is? Or guns. And he would smirk and say, nope, nothing we can do. Change that law. We didn't knock on Mr. Joe's door anymore because he changed his behavior. We focus too much on the end user. You know what I mean by end user? Because that's easy. Arrest a guy, put the gun away, on to the next. If we re-engineer how we go about doing things in terms of where's the funnel of these guns coming from, you'll change behavior. We had ATF go into this particular gun shop. I failed to mention every gun was bought legally, every one. And most of them, about 99.9% of them came from this one gun shop. Do you think they changed their behavior? Absolutely. Now that's risky. That's risky for a chief to do that because in Virginia, we love our guns. I embrace the Second Amendment. I must have given it the oath of office 200 times or more. And to get where I am, I had to take it myself at least 9 times. I have about 6 guns, give or take. But what I embrace is responsible gun ownership. Responsible gun ownership.
So I'm going to take moderator preference here. So Interim Chief Searles has been doing phenomenal work over the last couple of months, informing and introducing fentanyl and its impact on our community. Most of us are pretty ignorant about fentanyl and the impact it's having, not only in our community, but across the country. Have you had much involvement? What do you see in law enforcement's role other than obviously addressing behavior, but we're just starting to learn and crack the surface on fentanyl and what role it's playing or what it's doing to individuals and communities?
That's a good question. Fentanyl is no different from any other drug. Folks tend to think it's some mystery how you go about addressing it. You address it like you would any one other drug. The challenge is making it important, okay? So in Norfolk, we started seeing folks, die due to it, and we started tracking where we were finding individuals, folks that we could resuscitate through Narcan. We started getting information, and we started arresting folks that were doling the drug. So I'm a data guy. I capture everything. So what our map was showing us was that we saw the death going up, and we saw where we were recovering are responding to folks that OD in certain neighborhoods. That same process I just said about the guns, it would be the same process with respect to any illegal drug. Again, we tend to focus on the end user. We tend not to focus on the beginning because one is political. Folks, if you don't have a stomach for addressing things that are political, you're wasting my time. Because if we're playing politics, you're going to be playing them tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, next decade, so on and so on. Did I answer that?
I think so. All right. I like that. So this next question is around social service and restorative programming in that realm. But the question is around world resource services. I'm going to connect it to mental health calls and things of that nature. So what's your philosophy and approach to policing and mental health calls? And it goes far enough to ask, would you support helping get financing and funding for social service programming? I don't want to say in lieu of police, but the importance of having mental health services, support, restorative programs, all of that connecting with policing.
So one night around 1 a.m., I was at home. I stay up late, first of all. And I got a photograph sent to me. And just outside the emergency room, there was, give or take, 14, 15 beautiful police units lined up. I'm like, what in the world's going on? I'm thinking there's been a shooting, et cetera, and it was individuals that officers had to respond on that was going through a mental psychosis. That's problematic because, one, you know, the average call for each individual could be 4 hours or more. So who do you have in the field responding for calls for service? So I forward said picture to the city manager because I had started seeing the narrative, and a picture says 1,000 words. So, and the next day, he and I started putting together how could we defer some of this activity, particularly when you think about officer-involved shootings. One of the most high-risk time is when we're interfacing with folks going through, I think it's like 30% officer-involved shootings occurred during that time. So you got a lot of moving parts in that question. So we want to eliminate guns and badges going to these types of calls. So what we put together, and I don't know if they got that running just yet, but the package was complete, was a co-responders program where you have officers only going to those type calls where there's violence involved. So there was money set aside for mental health clinicians to go on the very vanilla type calls, but those calls where there may be violence, there was a co-partnership with a mental health clinician and not a uniform officer, but a police officer. So if he's not uniform, what is he? He's wearing a polo shirt and khakis, but he has his gun in his badge, just in case, right? So to answer your question, I look for any process where we could limit the workload of officers, okay? Urbana is a 21st century city. It really is in terms of philosophy. In terms of how do we get there as a PD unit, we're missing some pieces. But those pieces aren't a heavy lift. And I get a bit long-winded, so I'll shorten this up. yes, I support any program that can alleviate officers from going to the type of call solely, okay? But in addition to that, they have to be trained when they do have to go to those type of calls. And from what I understand, the officers are CIT, critical intervention trained, from what I understand.
So we have a number of different constituent groups here in our community. This next question is kind of dealing with the rise in hate locally as well as across the country against Jewish groups, our LGBT community groups, and we have pride parades here. We have a number of different community-wide events. Security at those events, how do you approach those issues?
So we're talking about gatherings of different groups with respect to security.
Yeah.
I would approach it the same way regardless of the event. You know, there are best evidence-based practices as it relates to security structures and how those structures are implemented depending on the size and scope of said event. The only thing that would change about how I go about implementing a security plan, if there's intel, okay, if there's intel that kind of highlights a specific threat. That's the only time that I would make some modification. People are people, regardless of who they belong to. The processes for us is the same.
You know, as society, we got to put everybody in a group, right, and operate from that place. So we have we're running down on the end. There is a survey that we're asking each of you to complete. Surveys are where, Fahmy? How are we handling surveys? Okay, so at the back table, if you don't mind, please complete the survey. That'll give us more information. I hope I'm getting to all of your questions. We have a couple of minutes here left. What's that, Mayor? Well, we got some submitted. Oh, got another one coming up. Why do you want to be chief here?
You know, let me say this. I'll just tell you what's out there because most of you already know it. I applied to Cincinnati and St. Louis, in both cities, and speaking with city leadership, they stressed to me that they wanted change. Everybody wanted change after the killing of George Floyd. Everybody. Now, to be honest with you, everybody, they may truly want it until it starts to manifest and what that looks like. So one of the things they wanted a chief that would be transparent. Well, I certainly was transparent in Norfolk. One of the things they wanted was a chief that would be inclusive and drive diversity. I certainly did that in Norfolk. One of the things they wanted from a chief that would have strong community relations. I certainly did that in Norfolk with all groups. One of the things they wanted was someone that could drive down crime. I did that in Norfolk as well. But when it came for a decision to be made with respect to me leading that department, some folks said he was too progressive. We're not quite ready for that. So, Urbana surfaced, and the gentleman that was in charge of the search, he kind of highlighted that, look, they're good people, just meet with them. They want all those things that you are able to deliver. And so far, that's been extremely true. Yeah, of course, you know, you want a bigger city. with those bigger cities come bigger headaches too. But I will say, Mayor Marlin and her staff has been extremely helpful to me in terms of working me through this. And this has been an arduous process, folks. I know I may make it look easy, but it really has. I was not expecting it to be this difficult. And, you know, where there's a genuine want and I can deliver, you know, I'll tell you, every time I come here, I'm starting to see myself as a good fit. This is a very diverse city, as small as it is. It's very diverse and it's very progressive. So Urbana, here I am.
All right. So, you know, drum roll, this is the last final question. We're a bicycle-friendly community. What's your thoughts on ticketing bicyclists for traffic activity?
Are there lanes? I hadn't seen any bicycle lanes here. Really? Well, look, as I started this out, you think you're unique. You're not, okay? And Norfolk, we're the same way, okay? We're the same way. I got to tell you, I don't recall ever hearing about anybody issuing a bicyclist a ticket. I've never heard of such a thing. Has that happened here? Okay. Well, you know, I embrace it.
All right. So, audience, thank you for coming out today. Our law enforcement group, I'm just proud and pleased to have you here in our community, and I was sharing with Chief Boone in the back to think about all the change we've gone through over the last decade, and we're still standing as a community. Have we got it all right? Probably not. Have we got it all wrong? Absolutely not, right? So I think we are a great community, and glad you are getting a chance to see that and experience that in your visits here. So we want to take a few moments and let you offer some final thoughts that you want to share with the audience.
Well, you know, I don't know what else I can say, folks, but other than thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know this is very important to you, particularly in the climate that we're in. You know, I've been around a very long time. I was here for Rodney King, right? Changes came from that. I was around doing Ferguson. Changes came from that, particularly regarding the acquisition of military equipment. You know, I know that's a big deal in certain communities. That's not a big deal here. You ought to know that your department really didn't get any military equipment. There's some departments got 30, 40, 50 issues. Tanks, helicopters, boats, machine guns, and I think you guys might acquire like 20 rifles, which is very benign. It really is. I say that because I don't think you know. Okay, a lot of times folks hear things and it becomes gospel unless it's challenged. So I said earlier, I call balls and strikes, and when I see things that aren't true, particularly after our research, I'm gonna let you know. I'd be remiss to let you walk away from here and not know that. I am telling you, I was shocked because in Norfolk we had almost all kinds of things until I said, wait a minute, What do we need a tank for? We don't need a tank. Send some of this stuff back, you know. I think that there's opportunity for us to do great things here. I'm going to lean on you. You know, if I'm selected and we come to an agreement, I'm going to support those officers. You may not like it at times. Sometimes there's going to be those situations that look awful, but it's lawful. You ever heard that phrase, awful but lawful? And then if we can improve upon that, we shall, right? Everybody doesn't need to go to jail. Everybody doesn't need to be, you know, forced to be used upon at times. There's improvement for all around, including myself. But I do know this, and I say this with big teeth. If I'm your chief and we come to an agreement, you're going to be better tomorrow than you are today. Thank you all for coming out. This is a very, very important issue. I want to thank the mayor once again for putting me through all this. Thank you, folks. Seriously, thank you.